Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in 1871 Oklahoma Territory, the missing sisters who were never found after a frontier raid. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the spring of 1871, the Oklahoma plains stretched quiet and endless, raw country scarred by the aftermath of frontier clashes like the Battle of the Washita River a few winters prior. The land still smelled of gunpowder and dust, and families who dared to settle there lived half in prayer, half in fear. Among them were the Dawson family, ranchers of modest means, whose small homestead sat near a bend in the Canadian River. According to the Comanche County deed records, the Dawsons had claimed their parcel just 2 years earlier. Isaac Dawson, a quiet man of 35, was known for his diligence and for the 2 daughters he raised alone, Clara and Eliza, twins barely 17. The girls were described in a surviving school register as polite, reserved, given to reading and song, though one line, written by the teacher Miss Halpern, stands out. The sisters often speak as one. Their thoughts seem shared. Neighbors later recalled the ranch as well-kept yet somber. The Dawsons rarely attended church, preferring the company of their small circle of ranch hands and the occasional passing trader. Still, nothing about them invited suspicion until the morning of June 4, 1871, when a rider from Fort Sill noticed smoke rising from the Dawsons' direction and found the corral empty, horses untethered, and the front door ajar. Inside, the table was still set for breakfast. 2 plates, a small pitcher of milk, and a Bible left open to the Book of Ruth. No signs of struggle, only a toppled chair, and a faint trail of dried mud leading toward the riverbank. Isaac Dawson was gone. So were the girls. By the following afternoon, a detachment from the nearest garrison arrived, expecting the worst, an attack. That same week, Lieutenant Merrow of the Territorial Guard mentioned in his report a renewed restlessness among bands north of Washita, again invoking the Battle of the Washita River as evidence that tensions had not fully cooled. To him, the Dawsons were simply another casualty of the plains, yet the evidence on the ground suggested something far stranger. A neighbor, Elias Cook, swore under oath that he had heard faint singing the night before the smoke rose. 2 voices, close and echoing, though no campfires burned nearby. Another local, Mrs. Barnett, claimed she saw 2 white dresses moving through the scrub at dawn, vanishing toward the ridge. As the soldiers scoured the property, they uncovered no blood, no tracks beyond the muddy prints that ended abruptly at the water's edge. For weeks afterward, settlers rode the riverbanks, following every rumor, every footprint, until the trail dissolved into silence. Even now, in the yellowed notes stored at the Fort Sill archive, one entry remains puzzling. Possible abduction, though by whom, uncertain. Evidence incomplete. Daughters presumed missing, not deceased. The official record stopped there. But stories, especially on the frontier, rarely did. For months after the disappearance, the Dawson homestead stood like a wound that refused to close. The hearth remained cold, the stable half collapsed, and locals said even the cattle avoided grazing near the creek bend. The territorial constable, Amos L. Greer, compiled what he could into a 6-page affidavit, one that today sits folded in the Comanche County archives. Its first line reads simply, "All gone, without struggle." Yet talk in nearby Fort Cobb was far less restrained. The frontier had long been a place where facts gave way to rumor, and the Dawsons' case was no exception. Some whispered that Isaac Dawson had staged the whole affair, fleeing debts. Others believed that raiders, perhaps a remnant of the same bands mentioned after the Battle of the Washita River, had struck again, this time quietly, leaving no trace. But a third group, mostly the ranch women, murmured something stranger, that the sisters had been seen days after the supposed raid, walking along the ridge at dusk, as if lost or bewitched. A blacksmith named Henry Toller offered one of the earliest testimonies. He claimed that 3 nights following the disappearance, while shoeing a horse under lamplight, he noticed movement across the prairie. 2 figures, both in white, walking hand in hand, could have sworn they were singing. Thought it was light playing tricks, but the sound lingered. Greer wrote this in his report, but added a note in pencil. Possible hysteria. As the weeks passed, more accounts surfaced. A farmer returning from Chickasha said he found small footprints near a wagon path, followed by deep impressions as though someone had been dragged. Another, a male writer, told of finding the Dawson's family Bible several miles north, its pages damp and stuck together by rain. The book, now kept in a private collection, still bears the faint initials CD on the inside cover. By midsummer, the townsfolk organized a voluntary search. Among them was Reverend Nathaniel Briggs, who had baptized the sisters years earlier. His sermon from July 1871 still survives in a faded clipping from the Territorial Gazette. The plains conceal what the Lord does not will to reveal. He urged the community to pray rather than speculate, though his tone, by some accounts, was more fearful than faithful. And then came the story of the horse at the well. A stray bay mare, identified by a brand belonging to Isaac Dawson, was found tethered behind the abandoned schoolhouse. In her saddlebag lay a locket, its glass cracked, showing two identical faces. The inscription beneath, "We remain." Greer's follow-up report, dated August 3rd, noted, "No sign of struggle upon the animal, bridle intact, cannot determine who placed it there." He attached the locket to the file, along with a hand-drawn map of the homestead and nearby ridge. That map, rediscovered decades later by a state historian reviewing cases related to the Washita River conflicts, reignited public curiosity, suggesting that perhaps the missing sisters' story had never been purely criminal, but tied somehow to the haunting residue of war. Whatever truth lay beneath those plains, it had been swallowed whole. The Dawsons' cabin, by autumn, was stripped for lumber. Their land was resold to another settler family, though few stayed long. Neighbors said that at night, the wind off the river carried an odd harmony, like two soft voices humming across the grass. By autumn of 1871, the Dawson case had passed from rumor to obsession. Constable Greer, weary of speculation, sent for Deputy Marshal Edward Hanley from Fort Sill to formalize the inquiry. Hanley's arrival was noted in a Gazette headline dated September 12th. Federal officer rides for the missing sisters. The article printed beneath it was brief, half factual, half appeal for calm, but it stirred the surrounding counties. Hanley was a precise man, educated and skeptical of superstition. His first impression of the Dawsons' ranch, according to his surviving field journal, was that it reeked of abandonment, not violence. He noted carefully that there were no bullet holes, no torn garments, not even the prints of boots or moccasins near the door. "If this were a raid," he wrote, "it was carried out by ghosts." The first contradiction arose from the testimony of Elias Cook, the same neighbor who had earlier claimed to hear singing. When re-questioned, he now swore that he'd seen Isaac Dawson 2 days after the supposed attack, on horseback, riding east, alone, with something heavy draped over his saddle. This detail, if true, rewrote everything, but there was no confirmation, and Hanley marked the entry. Unsubstantiated. Possible mistake of identity. A week later, a trader from Anadarko produced what he believed to be one of the missing girl's brooches, traded to him by a traveling band of Pawnee. When Hanley confronted the men, they denied any involvement and claimed to have found the item in the brush near the old trail. The brooch was indeed silver, engraved with the initials E.D. Yet Hanley, knowing the ease of fabrication, kept it only as potential evidence. That same month, a letter surfaced addressed to Reverend Briggs, written in uneven script and unsigned. It read, "Do not search the river. They are not there. Tell the mother, though she cannot hear, that they followed him willingly." But no mother was alive to receive such a message. Mrs. Dawson had died in childbirth years before. The handwriting was analyzed by a local schoolteacher, who concluded it matched neither the father nor his daughters. The letter vanished from the record soon after, presumably misplaced among county papers. As winter drew near, Hanley's frustration grew. He began corresponding with Colonel James Forsyth, who had commanded at the Battle of the Washita River, seeking insight into tribal movements and lost families taken after earlier conflicts. In one preserved note, Hanley wrote, "Your name arises often when these plains are spoken of. You understand what remains unspoken here. Those lost are not always slain." The colonel never replied, but the inquiry gave later historians a sense of the unease that lingered, how even disciplined men like Hanley began to sense that the Dawsons' disappearance was no simple crime. By December, heavy snow buried the plains, sealing the land and its secrets. The case was suspended. Hanley's last report ended with a chilling observation. If the wind is right, one might still hear faint song carried from the South Ridge. Whether by memory or presence, I cannot say. In the following spring, settlers returning to the area found the old Dawson house collapsed under frost and time. Beneath one beam, half hidden by melted snow, they discovered a woman's boot, its leather soft with age, its size too small for an adult. When the thaw came in the spring of 1872, it unearthed more than just prairie grass. Floodwaters receded from the Canadian River, exposing fragments of life long buried, buttons, wagon pieces, and a single iron key, later catalogued as item number 7, Dawson property. These finds drew renewed attention from settlers and soldiers alike, especially after a rider from Fort Sill reported seeing fresh disturbance near the river bluff where the Dawsons' trail had vanished a year earlier. The new marshal assigned to the territory, Robert Wainwright, reopened the investigation out of formality. He was younger than Hanley and less patient with local superstition, yet even he admitted that something about the case unsettled him. The records he inherited were thin and fragmented, many damaged by damp or carelessness. Yet in those half-faded pages, a single document stood out. Isaac Dawson's ledger, a small book of debts, supply notes, and short, personal lines. The handwriting was neat until the final pages, where the words became erratic. The last entry, dated May 31st, 1871, read, "They hum together now, always near the river. I do not sleep." Below it, a single line crossed through several times. "The sound is not theirs." Wainwright traced the ledger's provenance to a schoolteacher, Miss Halpern, who had taken possession of several household effects after the first search. When questioned, she said she had found the ledger beneath a loose floorboard, along with 2 dried flowers and a small lock of blonde hair tied in ribbon. She hesitated to surrender it, claiming the air changes when the pages are disturbed. Wainwright dismissed this as nerves, but noted her trembling hands in his report. That same season, a field team from Fort Sill documented several old encampments near the Washita tributary. Among the items recovered were glass beads, a broken pistol, and a child's comb. While most of these were attributed to scattered trading posts, one officer, Lieutenant Barrett, remarked in his log that the comb bore initials faintly carved along its spine. "C.D." Barrett added, "Could be coincidence, but the similarity to the Dawson girl's name unsettled me." The Battle of the Washita River resurfaced in Wainwright's correspondence once more, this time as a symbol rather than an explanation. In a letter to his superior he wrote, "The plains remember. We think time has buried these incidents, but the land itself reveals what paper denies." His phrasing later appeared in a 1902 historical review of early territorial law enforcement, cited as evidence of how myth and bureaucracy blurred on the frontier. By midsummer, a local paper reignited the mystery with a serialized piece titled "The Singing Sisters of the Ridge." The author, anonymous, claimed to have interviewed a drifter who once worked for Isaac Dawson. The man described the twins as peculiar but kind, given to wandering at dusk. He also said the girls often left small arrangements of stones by the river, as if marking something only they understood. That report, dismissed at the time as frontier gossip, would gain new weight decades later when scholars examined maps of the property and found faint geometric outlines near the old river course, arrangements too deliberate to be random. Whether they were graves, symbols, or simply the handiwork of lonely children remains uncertain. The mystery, it seemed, had thawed along with the land, emerging quiet, patient, and unsatisfied. By late summer of 1872, Marshal Wainwright's persistence began to unsettle even his own men. The Dawson Ridge had become a place people avoided, Children dared each other to ride past its edge, and ranchers quietly rerouted their herds to steer clear of the scrubland near the river bend. Yet Wainwright, armed with the surviving ledger and fresh testimonies, ordered a final sweep before the season turned cold again. Among his volunteers was Elias Cook, now older, grayer, and visibly haunted by his earlier testimony. He confessed privately to the marshal that he had withheld something, a detail too strange to include in the affidavit. On the night he'd heard the singing, he said, there was also the sound of a third voice, low and rasping, almost as if echoing the twins' tune. "It weren't human, sir," he whispered, "but not wild neither." Wainwright noted it simply as psychological distress. That same week, the team uncovered the remains of an old camp near the ridge, half buried in dry grass. Inside a collapsed canvas tent, they found rusted cookware, a torn cavalry coat, and a small hand mirror. Etched faintly into its back were the initials I.D. Isaac Dawson. The discovery reignited the question that had hovered since the beginning. Had Isaac fled? Or had he been here, hiding, watching? A young corporal assisting Wainwright described finding something else, stranger still. A circle of stones beneath the tent's remnants, each one smudged with what looked like soot. In the center, a wooden figure, crude and blackened, lay face down. No one could tell whether it was a charm, a marker, or simply debris. But when Wainwright ordered it moved, the corporal swore he heard a faint hum in the air, like wind through glass. When the item was later catalogued, the clerk who handled it fell ill and claimed to hear two women speaking softly whenever the wind rose outside. His quarters. The superstition spread quickly through the ranks, forcing Wainwright to lock the evidence inside a chest at the garrison. His official report, however, made no mention of such accounts, only a curt note. Recovered possible personal effects near Ridge, unconfirmed link to Dawson family. In September, Reverend Briggs returned to the region to perform a memorial service, though no bodies had ever been found. His sermon, printed again in the Gazette, made passing reference to a darkness the Washita could not wash away, subtly echoing his earlier mention of the Battle of the Washita River. Some believed he meant the lingering guilt of war. Others thought he referred to something older and less earthly that the plains kept hidden. The final entry in Wainwright's diary that year is brief but telling. They said the girls' songs came from the wind, but the wind here does not sing, it listens. After that autumn, no further expeditions were organized. The case was declared closed in the spring of 1873 due to insufficient evidence, and the official file containing photographs, the locket, and the ledger was sent to territorial storage in Guthrie. Yet even with the paperwork sealed, the legend refused to rest. Travelers along the Canadian River claimed that when campfires burned low, a faint harmony could be heard, two voices in unison and a third just beneath, too deep to belong to either girl. By the mid-1880s, the disappearance of the Dawson sisters had already faded from official memory, but not from the land itself. Settlers who arrived after statehood found fragments of their story woven into campfire talk, half history, half warning. The ridge, now overgrown with mesquite and sage, was known simply as the Humming Ground. In 1886, a visiting historian named Professor Elias Brome from St. Louis arrived in the territory to study the early frontier conflicts. His focus was the aftermath of the Battle of the Washita River. But while reviewing militia records, he stumbled upon the sealed Dawson file misfiled under R. River Incidents. The contents fascinated him, not because of any confirmed crime, but because the details hinted at a persistent auditory phenomenon reported independently by multiple witnesses. Brome wrote to the Fort Sill Historical Society describing his findings. His letter, published decades later, paraphrased the testimonies as accounts of female voices perceived at distance and uncorrelated to any living source. He dismissed the supernatural interpretations, proposing instead that the echoes of the river valley and its geology might create unusual sound reflections. Yet even as he argued for rationality, his tone betrayed unease. "The ground hums where it should not," he wrote, "and at certain hours the wind seems to carry memory as if it were matter." That same year, a farmer named Thomas Delane began cultivating land just north of the ridge. His plow struck metal, an old lockbox, rusted nearly through. Inside were water-damaged documents, a hairbrush, and several pages of what appeared to be a diary. The handwriting, faint and slanted, matched Isaac Dawson's from the ledger. One entry stood out, dated shortly before the family vanished. "They have begun to walk at night. I follow, though I no longer know which is which." When Elaine delivered the box to the county seat, the clerk refused to catalog it, claiming the writing fades when read aloud. The items were eventually forwarded to Guthrie, but like so many frontier artifacts, they disappeared into bureaucratic limbo, never officially recorded, never officially lost. Local papers revived interest once more with serialized retellings, each twisting the tale further. In one, Isaac was portrayed as a man driven mad by isolation. In another, the sisters were said to have joined an outlaw band disguised as men. None agreed on the truth, yet all shared one image: two figures walking hand in hand through the mist, forever beyond reach. By 1890, Reverend Briggs had long passed away, but his journal survived. In its final entry, written the year before his death, he recorded a dream. "I saw them by the river, hair long and faces pale as the moon. They smiled, as though they forgave me for not finding them." Professor Brome would later cite this very note in his follow-up essay, calling it an example of faith transforming tragedy into myth. He concluded in words that still echo through regional folklore circles: "On the frontier, belief fills the gaps that evidence cannot." And so, the missing sisters of the Oklahoma Territory passed quietly from case file to campfire, half fact, half haunting. Yet the ground where their home once stood remained oddly barren. Nothing grew there but the whisper of wind and the faint, unaccountable hum. In 1892, Professor Elias Brome returned to the territory once more, this time funded by the St. Louis Society for Anthropological Studies. His aim, officially, was to compile a comparative review of folkloric phenomena arising from post-conflict frontier settlements. Unofficially, he sought the truth of the Dawson case that had refused to let him go. By then, the Ouachita Plains had changed. Rail tracks cut through where riders once camped, and the Dawson Ridge had been partially quarried for stone. Still, older residents remembered. Brome interviewed 7 locals, all unrelated, who claimed to have heard what they called the Sisters' Hymn. Their descriptions matched eerily, despite the distance between farms, always 2 voices in harmony, low and mournful, rising with the wind just after dusk. Brome documented each account meticulously, noting variations in timing and direction. His surviving field notes, now preserved at the Oklahoma Historical Center, describe one evening when he too heard something. A sound like 2 tones merging upon the breeze, high, then faint, then gone. The sensation was not of hearing, but of memory invoked. Around this time, new material surfaced from the old Guthrie archive. A box mislabeled, unassigned evidence, Fort Sill. Inside were fragments of paper, a cracked locket, and the remnant of a mirror with initials ID etched faintly upon its back, the same one Marshall Wainwright had described 20 years earlier. Alongside it was a field report referencing the Battle of the Ouachita River, linking a detachment's patrol route to the very ridge where the Dawsons had vanished. Brome speculated that Isaac Dawson might have stumbled upon something left from that conflict, something others wished forgotten. To the local press he offered a restrained explanation. "The case is an echo of our national unrest, when the lines between civilian and soldier, captive and settler, blurred in the dust." Privately, however, he confessed unease to a colleague in a letter that survives only in fragments. "If what they heard were mere wind, then why does it repeat precisely at the hour their home burned?" One of Brome's interviews with a woman named Agnes Toller proved especially unsettling. Her father, the blacksmith Henry Toller, who first reported seeing two white figures, had kept a journal until his death. In its final entry, dated 1881, he wrote, "Heard the song again near the well. Thought to follow, but my legs froze as if bound. When I looked down, I saw two shadows, though I stood alone." Brome's paper on the Dawson case was eventually published under the title Resonance of Absence, a study in frontier folklore. It concluded cautiously, proposing that geological factors and trauma combine to shape acoustic myths. Yet his closing line betrayed something deeper, perhaps even belief. Some stories hum not in air, but in the marrow of the land. After his departure, locals noted that the hum by the ridge had grown louder that winter, audible even to travelers on the main road. Farmers swore their animals balked near the site, and one night a passing freight engineer reported hearing a hymn rise clear above the sound of iron. By spring, the reports dwindled again, as if the land had exhaled and fallen silent. But silence, in that place, had never meant peace. When the new century dawned, Oklahoma was no longer a frontier, but a forming state, and yet the story of the Dawson sisters refused to fade. In 1901, the newly established Territorial Historical Bureau undertook an effort to catalog unsolved cases from the early settlement years. Among the boxes retrieved from Guthrie's damp storeroom was file number 117A, the Dawson disappearance. Its contents, brittle and water-stained, were re-examined by Dr. Helen Marrow, one of the first women historians admitted to the Bureau. Dr. Marrow's notes, preserved in the state archives, show that she approached the matter with both skepticism and empathy. She was intrigued not by the mystery itself, but by the patterns, how certain details repeated across decades, the harmony in the wind, the river's hum, the unaccountable light sometimes seen on the ridge. The same phrases, she wrote, reappear as if passed down by the land, not the people. During her field survey, Marrow visited what was left of the Dawson homestead. The ground had long since shifted. Erosion had eaten away much of the riverbank, and the original foundation stones were scattered. She found only fragments, a rusted nail, a child's buckle, and the ghost outline of a hearth. Still, in her report she noted, the air was unnaturally still, though a wind moved the grass beyond the fence line. It seemed to pause here, as if listening. Her investigation coincided with a renewed scholarly interest in the Battle of the Washita River, now being reassessed as a tragic symbol of the American frontier's brutality. Several journalists covering that reevaluation drew parallels to the Dawson mystery, pointing out that both stories shared the same geography, the same unquiet ground, and the same echoes of disappearance. Marrow, though reluctant to romanticize tragedy, mentioned the event twice in her papers as a reminder that peace is ever truly settled on these plains. A year later, while reviewing property records, Marrow discovered that the Dawson parcel had changed ownership 6 times in 30 years. Every deed contained an identical clause. The buyer acknowledges awareness of local legend and accepts all associated risks. When questioned, county clerks laughed it off as superstition, but one admitted privately that several tenants complained of music without source at night. In 1903, a railroad crew clearing brush near the ridge unearthed what they thought was a buried cellar. Inside was a shallow depression lined with limestone and the remains of a wooden beam. Nothing of value remained except a single iron hook and, beneath it, a length of ribbon, sun-faded but still bound in a perfect bow. Marrow's field assistant described it as deliberately placed, not dropped. When she compared the ribbon's color to the one mentioned in Isaac Dawson's ledger, a yellow band for the girl's hair, she fell silent. Her journal entry that night was uncharacteristically emotional. If this is theirs, then perhaps the land has given its only confession. The discovery was photographed, catalogued, and quietly forgotten by the Bureau, buried under the next decade's paperwork. But among locals, the find rekindled the legend. Travelers once again claimed to hear soft singing on clear nights, 2 tones rising faintly from the riverbank, and older settlers began to say that the sisters were not lost. They were waiting. By the autumn of 1904, Dr. Helen Marrow had returned to the Dawson site twice more, this time accompanied by 2 research assistants from the Territorial Bureau. Her official purpose was to complete a photographic survey of vanishing frontier properties. Yet her private journal reveals a more personal intent. She wanted to hear the ridge for herself. In a letter to a colleague, she wrote, "The land here resists silence. One cannot stand alone by the river without the sense that something once said lingers in the air, not as sound, but as vibration." Her assistants, Mr. Alton Ray and Miss Clara Beebe, initially dismissed this as fatigue from long travel. But on their second evening, while camping near the ruined foundation, all 3 reported hearing a faint melody carried across the water, 2 distinct voices, clear for only a moment before vanishing. Marrow, trained to distrust coincidence, noted the exact time and weather. Wind from the south, 9:47 p.m., temperature near freezing. She then added a curious postscript. "We found the same pattern again at dawn, identical in tone and interval." Beebe's later deposition, taken years afterward when her eyesight had begun to fail, corroborates this. She told a reporter from the El Reno Ledger, "It was not music like a tune, but more like breath drawn into air. You felt it before you heard it." Ray, the second assistant, was less articulate but more unsettled. In his field sketches preserved by the Bureau, he drew the outline of the ridge with faint looping marks above it, as if trying to capture motion. Beneath one sketch he scrawled, "They walk as the sun lowers." The following week, Marrow attempted to locate the source of the sound using a simple directional chart, marking each point where the hum grew stronger. Her notes show a rough oval encompassing the same area where the ribbon and cellar remains had been found a year earlier. She wrote, "The circle closes where the earth dips shallowest, suggesting a burial, though no subsidence is visible." When she returned to her lodgings at Fort Cobb, she began to experience what she called auditory residue. In her diary, she confessed that each night she heard the same 2 tones faintly when trying to sleep. "The mind repeats what the land remembers," she wrote. In February of 1905, one of her assistants, Alton Ray, vanished en route to deliver field plates to Guthrie. His horse was found 3 days later, reins dragging, saddle empty. The only clue was Ray's notebook, discovered miles from the trail. Its last entry, barely legible, read, "Heard them again by the cut bank. This time, one called my name." The Territorial Bureau quietly closed Marrow's project soon afterward, citing resource constraints. Her final report was filed but never published. Yet, within academic circles, whispers persisted that she had uncovered evidence linking the Dawsons' disappearance, not to violence, but to a recurring natural resonance from the river valley, what she described in one letter as a voice that borrows memory. That same year, newspapers revived coverage of the Battle of the Washita River, drawing renewed parallels between war and haunting. Marrow herself, interviewed briefly by the Oklahoma Gazette, gave a single cryptic response when asked if she believed in ghosts. "No, but I believe some events never finish speaking." The disappearance of Alton Ray in early 1905 sent quiet ripples through the Territorial Bureau, but never reached the press in full. Only a brief mention appeared in the Fort Sill Bulletin. Assistant surveyor presumed lost during transit. Privately, however, Dr. Helen Marrow's surviving correspondence reveals a more unsettling story. She wrote to her superior, Director James L. Beecham, insisting that Ray had not been lost by accident. "His final notes match precisely the auditory pattern we recorded," she explained. "Either he pursued it too closely, or something pursued him." Beecham, alarmed by the language, ordered her to cease all fieldwork pending review. His memo, still preserved in the Bureau archive, reads simply, "Project terminated. Personnel exhibiting signs of emotional disturbance." Marrow obeyed outwardly, but continued documenting the incident in secret. Her private journal for March 1905 recounts visiting the site alone, against orders. She described finding the area eerily undisturbed, except for one detail. The frost upon the ground was marked by 2 shallow impressions, as if of bare feet side by side. She measured them, 7 inches each, consistent with a young woman. Not prince of weight, she wrote, but of presence. Her last entry on the subject came a week later. I heard the voices again, closer this time. They did not sing. They called. One spoke my name. Within a month, Marrow resigned from the Bureau, citing nervous exhaustion. She returned to St. Louis and never published another word about the Dawsons. Colleagues later described her as lucid but withdrawn, avoiding discussions of the Oklahoma Plains altogether. Meanwhile, local papers began reprinting older tales of the missing sisters, often embellishing them into ghost stories to entertain readers. The Ouachita County Review ran a serialized piece titled The Twins of the Kahat Ridge, portraying the sisters as spirits haunting the very soldiers who once fought along the Ouachita River. Though exaggerated, the articles revived unease among settlers. Travelers claimed that livestock still balked near the old homestead site, and some swore the air itself carried a hum like hymn and lament mixed together. By 1907, the land was sold again, this time to a railway contractor named Samuel Pritchard. He dismissed the legends as nonsense until his foreman reported hearing a woman's voice in the culvert, clear as day. Pritchard laughed, until a week later when workers unearthed a rusted ring of iron buried deep in the embankment, identical to the hooks described in Wainwright's century-old report. Rather than file an incident report, Pritchard quietly ordered the culvert sealed with stone. He told no one why, though his foreman later claimed that the night afterward, Pritchard sat by his campfire muttering, "They won't call me next." The Bureau's official stance by then was silence. The Dawsons file was reclassified as legendary incident, no further inquiry. Marrow's papers remained sealed until long after her death, and Ray's name faded from the rolls. Yet in the surrounding countryside, older residents still swore that on cold spring nights, just after sunset, a pair of tones rose from the ridge, sometimes accompanied by a third, lower one. The wind carried it lightly, almost kindly, but the closer one listened, the clearer it became, until it no longer sounded like song at all. By 1911, the railroad ran straight through what had once been Dawson land, a thin silver line cutting the plains cleanly in half. Steam and iron had reached even the quietest corners of Oklahoma Territory, and with them came the illusion that the past had finally been tamed. But in the shadow of progress, certain stories refused to stay buried. The El Reno Tribune published an anniversary article that spring titled 40 Years Since the Vanishing of the Dawson Sisters. It was intended as nostalgia, a look back at the hardships of early settlers, but the piece took on a life of its own. Within weeks, letters poured in from readers claiming family connections, lost journals, or sightings near the ridge. One came from a former telegraph operator, Mr. Whitford, who swore he once heard two voices humming through his receiver while stationed near the rail spur at night. Not interference, he wrote, not static, harmony. Rail crews began referring to that stretch of track as the Whisper Line. Some refused to camp near it, insisting that the sound carried through the rails long after dark. The company dismissed these reports as fatigue, though a memorandum dated August 1912 quietly ordered night shifts rotated to prevent recurring disturbances among workers. Meanwhile, a new generation of researchers rediscovered Dr. Helen Marrow's field notes, now yellowed but intact. Among them was Professor Lawrence D. Beecham, son of the former Bureau director who had once silenced her work. He found her descriptions meticulous, her tone rational, nothing like the emotional disturbance once alleged. In a paper read before the Oklahoma Historical Association, he cautiously re-examined her claims. If resonance exists within these valleys, geological, atmospheric, or otherwise, it might explain the phenomenon attributed to haunting. He avoided the supernatural entirely, yet his concludes. Sion echoed hers. Certain places record what cannot be spoken. Beecham's academic curiosity reignited local superstition. Soon after, a group of university students from Norman camped near the site to conduct their own acoustic experiments. Only 2 of the 4 stayed through the night. Their account, published anonymously in a campus newsletter, described a droning hum rising precisely at midnight, followed by what one called 2 notes, sustained and impossibly human. A rancher living nearby, Mrs. Ada Collins, corroborated their story a week later in a sworn statement. "I heard it too, the same time, same sound. It ain't wind. The dogs didn't bark. They just listened." By the end of the decade, the whisper line had become part of local folklore. Mothers warned children not to follow the sound when the air turned still. Travelers who stopped along the ridge sometimes found their watches had lost time. And though technology had changed everything around it, the land itself seemed untouched, unchanging, as though holding its breath. When the State Historical Commission met in 1918 to mark sites of early settlement, one member suggested a plaque near the old Dawson property. The proposal was quietly denied. The official record simply noted, "No commemoration recommended. Local sensitivities remain." And so, even as modern Oklahoma took shape, the ridge remained empty, save for grass, silence, and the occasional hum that no machine could explain. By 1919, the Great War had ended, and the country turned its gaze toward modernity. Airplanes crossed skies once haunted by silence, and electric lines now traced routes that cattle trails once marked. Yet in the small towns scattered along the Washita River, the old stories persisted, retold in parlors and depot benches whenever the nights grew still enough to listen. It was during this period that Professor Lawrence Beecham, now older and deeply respected in Oklahoma's historical community, made his final attempt to settle the Dawson mystery once and for all. He secured a modest grant from the State University to conduct what he termed a closing survey of anomalous rural legends. On his list stood 3 locations, one of them, Ridge Site No. 4, the old Dawson property. Beecham arrived in June 1919, armed not with shovels or rifles like those before him, but with notebooks, a phonograph, and 2 assistants, Mr. Paul Haskins, a geologist, and Miss Ruth Danner, a graduate student in folklore. The trio camped 2 nights beside the Canadian River, mapping the area once more. They found little of the old structure, only a few sunken stones and a rusted horseshoe. But the sound that had drawn generations returned almost immediately. Haskins described it in his log as a tonal vibration at twilight, approximate pitch F minor, source indeterminate. He theorized that the ridge's limestone might act as a natural resonator, amplifying wind currents into tones. Danner disagreed, insisting the sound seemed too deliberate. Her personal letter to a friend, found years later among her effects, was more candid. It wasn't the wind, it was 2 voices, faint but aware of us. Beecham recorded their observations on wax cylinders, though most were later lost to heat damage. One surviving fragment, barely audible, contains a wavering hum, low and hollow, followed by what might be the fog, or a trace of harmony. When played back at the university, decades later, technicians noted that the sound pattern repeated precisely every 36 seconds, suggesting intention rather than random airflow. During the survey, Beecham unearthed a bent iron hook from the same embankment where Pritchard's crew had worked years earlier. It matched the description in the 1870s reports. Rather than treat it as superstition, he labeled it artifact of domestic origin, though his field diary contained one uncharacteristic line beneath the catalog number. Found near source of tone. Do not disturb again. After the expedition, Beecham presented his findings at the Oklahoma Historical Society, emphasizing geological causes. But colleagues noted a change in his demeanor. One witness recalled him pausing mid-lecture, as if hearing something no one else could, before muttering, "Yes, I know," and resuming his talk. A year later, Beecham published his final essay, Echoes on the Frontier, where he concluded, carefully, that the Dawson legend exemplified how trauma becomes geography. He mentioned the Battle of the Washita River once more as the event that had scarred the land into remembrance. It was both an academic statement and perhaps a confession that some silences can never truly be explained. By 1920, nearly 50 years had passed since the disappearance of Clara and Eliza Dawson. Most who had known them were gone. The ridge remained unmarked, the file remained sealed, and the hum, though fainter now, was said to drift across the river only on cold nights when the wind came from the south. Those who still listened claimed that if one stood very still, the 2 tones would join in harmony, and for a fleeting moment, a third would rise beneath them, low, patient, and waiting. By 1921, the last living witnesses of the Dawson years were gray and half forgotten. Those who had once searched the ridge now sat on courthouse porches, recalling the past as if it were someone else's dream. The world had changed too quickly for them. Telephones, radios, the promise of airplanes filling the sky, yet their voices still returned, almost reflexively, to the story of the missing sisters. Among them was Mrs. Ada Collins, now in her 80s, the rancher who decades before had sworn that even her dogs once listened to the ridge. A reporter from the Oklahoma Ledger interviewed her that spring, hoping for a final quote before she passed. Her words, trembling but clear, became the article's closing line. "You can build all the cities you want, but that land still remembers them girls." That same month, Professor Beecham, aging and frail, revisited his earlier field notes for what would be his last lecture before retirement. Students remembered him as quiet, almost reverent, when he spoke of the case. He no longer sought to prove or disprove the mystery. Instead, he reflected, "The Dawsons are not ghosts. They are consequence." The plains themselves, having witnessed too much, kept something alive so that we would not forget. In a private letter to the university curator, Beecham enclosed one of the wax cylinders recorded during his 1919 expedition. He instructed that it not be played unless the air is still and respectful. The curator complied for decades, until the archive itself was moved and the cylinder misplaced. Its label simply read, "Canadian River, Twilight." Meanwhile, the ridge grew wild again. Brush overtook the old trails, and the culvert sealed by Pritchard's men collapsed beneath spring floods. The land reclaimed its shape as if smoothing over scars. Locals who lived nearby no longer spoke of singing, though some nights the telephone lines crackled with a sound too rhythmic to be static. One operator, unaware of the legend, reported hearing a faint duet, like someone tuning a violin. A few scholars attempted to revive interest. One, a young historian named Marion Tibbett, tried to compile a definitive record of the case, gathering old testimonies, maps, and letters. Her notes ended abruptly after a visit to the ridge in September 1921. The final page of her journal read only, "The wind hums in pairs." She never published her findings, though her unfinished manuscript, The Vanishing Sisters of the Washita, still rests in the Oklahoma Historical Society's restricted collection. By the year's end, the site had been officially designated Unremarkable Prairie. The last official mention of the Dawsons in any state record appeared in a brief line within the Bureau's closing ledger, "Subject deemed folkloric, file retired." And so, the paperwork ended. The whispers did not. Locals claimed that when the summer air grew heavy before storms, the ridge still resonated faintly. Two notes, rising from the earth itself, carrying across the darkened plains. Professor Beecham died quietly that winter. Among his effects was a small envelope labeled Washita Memory. Inside, only a single pressed flower and a line written in his hand. "The wind does not sing, it remembers." Through the 1920s, the ridge lay undisturbed, its story retreating into folklore as Oklahoma modernized. Highways carved new routes far from the Canadian River, and the name Dawson appeared only in aging newspaper clippings and faded property deeds. Yet, among local teachers and librarians, the legend lingered, a cautionary tale whispered to children during summer storms. In 1923, the Oklahoma Historical Society received a shipment of unsorted files from the dissolved Territorial Bureau. Among them was the long-lost Dawson file number 117A, its envelope brittle, seal half-broken. Archivist Jonathan Phelps, newly appointed and eager to make his mark, began cataloging its contents. Inside, he found fragments of the old locket, Isaac Dawson's ledger, several blurred photographs, and one wax cylinder labeled in faint pencil, "Ridge, Evening 1919. Curiosity overcame protocol. Phelps set up a phonograph after hours and played the cylinder once. In his log, now preserved with the archives, he wrote, "Initial playback, faint static, indistinct tones, then 2 harmonic sounds, sustained and clear. Second voice enters, lower, uncertain, ends abruptly." He added no interpretation, only a final note. Do not play again. The cylinder was placed in storage and sometime during the 1930s went missing entirely. A few months after Phelps' discovery, the Society discussed placing a marker near the ridge to commemorate the frontier family lost to history. The motion passed briefly, then was rescinded after a council member from Comanche County warned that locals still regarded the land as restless. In his words, "The folks there don't want memory disturbed." The idea was quietly dropped, and the site remained unmarked. Still, the legend persisted in quieter forms. That same decade, a teacher named Mrs. Danner, possibly a distant relative of Beecham's assistant, began recording oral histories from elderly residents of Fort Cobb. In one transcript, an unnamed farmer claimed that his grandfather had found 2 matching ribbons buried in a tree root near the river, faded yellow, tied perfect like twins. When asked what became of them, he replied, "Burned 'em. The wind cried after." The Battle of the Washita River returned once again to public discussion when historians sought to reinterpret the conflict as both tragedy and turning point. Each mention seemed to summon the Dawson story from obscurity. Articles about the war's aftermath invariably received letters from readers recalling the Singing Ridge. One journalist remarked that the 2 tales had become entwined, as though the land insists on telling both at once. By the end of the decade, the site had become a kind of secret pilgrimage for poets and drifters, those drawn by rumor and silence. A few claimed to have heard nothing, others swore they heard everything. One traveler's diary, found years later in a Tulsa bookshop, described the sound precisely. Not haunting, not human, just 2 breaths crossing paths forever. The 1920s ended with the land unchanged, still wild, still listening. Each attempt to commemorate or close its story faltered, as if the ridge itself refused punctuation. The hum, the harmony, the low echo, it all remained. When the 1930s Dust Bowl swept across Oklahoma, the ridge that once held the Dawson homestead nearly vanished beneath waves of dust and shifting earth. The wind that had once carried faint song now roared like an endless sea, stripping paint, choking livestock, and burying memories under a film of grit. Yet amid the ruin, the legend found new life. Thousands of displaced families migrated through the Canadian River Basin seeking fertile ground. Some camped near the ridge, unaware of its history, until nightfall brought the old unease. A diary from Martha Ellery, a migrant mother traveling west in 1933, describes her family's first night there. Wind so strong it whistled like pipes. But just before dawn, I heard 2 voices, clear as any hymn. Thought it was my girls dreaming, but they slept sound. Word spread through the camps. Travelers began calling the site Twin Hollow, claiming it carried the hum of the lost. For those beaten by drought and despair, the story became comfort as much as fear, proof that even in endless emptiness, someone, somewhere, was still singing. Folklorists collecting songs from the region during this time noted a haunting ballad titled The Dawson Daughters. Its verses blended history and superstition. They walked where the Washita bends in sorrow, hand in hand till the night took hold. The wind keeps their names till tomorrow, in the hum of the prairie cold. The melody, recorded by Alan Rollins, a WPA field archivist, carried 2 intertwining vocal lines, one slightly above the other, like a harmony that could not rest. Rollins later wrote in his field notes, "Locals claim the tune comes from the land itself, that no 2 singers can hold it true for long. It changes with the wind." During the worst years of the storms, families passing through used the Dawson legend as a kind of warning. They told their children that when the wind rise, O's in pairs, 2 tones humming together, it meant to move camp before dawn. The Sister's Song, they called it, a sign that the air is turning. Whether superstition or survival instinct, it spread across counties, quietly saving lives. Even government engineers who came later to assess erosion recorded odd acoustic behavior near the ridge. One report filed in 1936 by a surveyor named Gordon Finn mentions unexplained resonant vibration beneath wind gusts, duration irregular, distinctly tonal. Finn dismissed it as geological anomaly, but added in pencil, locals say the river sings to itself. By the end of the decade, the dust storms eased, and the migrants moved on. But the legend remained, transformed now into folklore, song, and survival. The Dawson story had crossed from case file to culture, from tragedy to warning. Still, the land gave no answer. When the wind stilled, the plain seemed to hold its breath, as though even after 60 years it was waiting for the right moment to begin humming again. When the 1940s arrived, the world turned its gaze far beyond Oklahoma. The nation was at war again, and the endless plains that had once seemed haunted now served as training grounds and supply routes. The ridge near the Canadian River, by then long forgotten in maps, found itself adjacent to a new airfield built for pilot exercises. Soldiers came and went, their engines drowning out the old hum of the land. Yet sometimes between flights, the silence returned, and with it, something faint. A mechanic stationed there in 1943, Private Alan Monroe, wrote to his wife, "The wind here is strange. It sounds like singing sometimes, right out of the soil. The men joke it's ghosts, but it's not like any sound I've heard before." His letter was preserved, later tucked among wartime correspondence collected by the base historian. That same year, the newly formed Oklahoma Radio Preservation Project began transferring old wax recordings to disc. Among the batches sent from the Historical Society was a damaged cylinder marked simply Ridge, Evening 1919. The archivist, unaware of its origin, played it during a test broadcast. Listeners phoning the station afterward described hearing a low hum and two faint female voices. The broadcast was never repeated, but it left its mark. A clipping from the Daily Oklahoman noted, "Old frontier record airs on radio. Strange tones unsettle listeners." Scholars later confirmed it had been one of Professor Beecham's recordings, presumed lost since the 1920s. For a brief moment, the forgotten case of the Dawson sisters flickered back into the public ear. A local historian, Dr. Cora Latham, seized on the coincidence, writing in her wartime essay, Frontier Memory and the Sound of Loss. Even when our dead are countless, certain voices persist, those unburied in spirit, still vibrating through place. She referenced the Battle of the Washita River as an earlier echo of the same sorrow, arguing that the plains themselves carried trauma as sound. For soldiers stationed nearby, the tale became an informal campfire story. They called it the Ridge Song. Some claimed that on quiet nights before training flights, they could hear a harmony faint beneath the wind. Others laughed it off, but one pilot, Lieutenant Reeves, whose diary survives, described it differently. It wasn't frightening, just sad, like the earth humming to itself for what it's lost. After the war, when the base closed, the field fell silent again. The hangars decayed, the runways cracked with weeds. Locals said the quiet that followed was heavier than before, as though the machines had only stirred what already lingered beneath. By the decade's end, the ridge stood empty once more. No houses, no markers, only wind through prairie grass. Few remembered the Dawsons by name, but the story endured in melody, in folklore, and in a handful of letters where men tried to describe a sound that reason could not hold. The world had changed beyond recognition. Yet for those who passed near the river at dusk, there were moments, brief, uncertain, when the old harmony returned, two voices rising out of the hum of the plains and fading before anyone could be certain they had heard them at all. By the 1950s, Oklahoma had been remade again, paved highways, bright motels, and the hum of radios replacing the wind's old songs. Yet amid this modern clatter, a new generation of scholars found themselves drawn to what the locals still called the Singing Ridge. They came not with shovels or rifles this time, but with tape recorders and notebooks, chasing a sound that refused to die. Among them was Dr. Everett Lang, a folklore researcher from the University of Kansas. His project, Residual Myths of the American Frontier, brought him through the Ouachita Basin in the summer of 1953. He found the story of the Dawson sisters still alive, passed from farmers, widows, and schoolchildren who knew the tune though none could trace its words. Lang's field tapes captured crackling interviews filled with half-remembered lines of the old Dust Bowl ballad, The Dawson Daughters. In one recording, an elderly rancher named Tom Pritchard, a descendant of the railway contractor who had sealed the culvert in 1907, confessed, "Pa said the ridge was quieter after they closed it up, but not empty. Said if you listen close enough, you'll still hear 'em, humming low like they're waiting for a train that never came." Lang found the remark poetic, but unsettling. Over 3 nights, he camped near the same ridge with a reel-to-reel recorder set to capture ambient sound. The first 2 nights yielded only wind and crickets, but the third, August 17, 1953, produced a faint pattern he later described as 2 tonal vibrations overlapping at human pitch. When replayed in his lab, the tape registered frequencies consistent with female voices, though no words were discernible. Lang published his findings the next year in The Journal of Western Folklore, cautiously calling it a coincidence of wind and memory amplified by expectation. Privately, he told a colleague, "I felt watched the whole time." The discovery reignited debate within historical circles. Some insisted the phenomenon was meteorological. Others saw it as a cultural echo of trauma reaching back to the Battle of the Ouachita River, where human grief had been etched into the land itself. Newspapers picked up the story once again. One headline read, "Old Ghost Song Baffles Scientists." The article quoted Lang, his words clipped of caution. Certain frequencies seemed tied to loss. Tourists followed. Couples drove out on weekends, parking near the riverbank with transistor radios tuned to static, hoping to catch the legendary hum. Most heard nothing but wind. A few swore they heard harmony just after midnight, a soft duet fading into the static. Locals began to avoid the ridge again, tired of curious visitors leaving litter and crosses. By the decade's end, a drought returned. The fields dried and dust moved once more across the lowlands. It was said the humming grew stronger that summer, audible even from the highway. Drivers told of hearing it through closed windows. 2 tones, low and mournful, rising beneath the rattle of their engines. Dr. Lang never returned. His final letter on the subject, written in 1956, ends with a single line. "The Dawsons will not rest, because the land still listens." By the late 1950s, the ridge no longer appeared on most maps. New developments had pushed the frontier of memory elsewhere, toward cities, highways, and glowing signs that promised progress. Yet to those who lived along the Canadian River, the story of the Dawson sisters remained a quiet inheritance, spoken rarely, but never forgotten. The field where their home once stood had become a thin line of grass between 2 properties, nothing remarkable except for how little would grow there. A telephone pole now marked the spot. Travelers said the wire sometimes carried an odd undertone, not quite interference, not quite wind. Locals joked that the sisters had learned to sing through copper. When historians revisited old reports, Constable Greer's affidavits, Marshall Wainwright's notes, Dr. Marrow's journals, and Professor Beecham's recordings, they found contradictions impossible to reconcile. Tracks that vanished, objects misplaced, then rediscovered, names repeating across generations like echoes. Each tried to anchor the tale to fact, but the deeper they searched, the more it seemed to dissolve into the soil itself. One archivist in 1959, sorting the last unsorted boxes from Guthrie, found a single photograph labeled "Unidentified Homestead, 1870s." The image was blurred, the exposure poor, but 2 figures seemed to stand near the doorway, indistinct, almost reflections. He sent it to the University of Oklahoma for analysis. Their response, written in pencil on the back, said only, "No conclusion possible." By then, the old song had become folklore, then ghost story, then silence again. Yet sometimes silence holds its own melody. Teachers in Comanche County still warned children not to linger by the river after dusk. Fishermen swore their lines trembled when the wind turned south, and during storms, when thunder rolled too close to the Ouachita, some claimed they could hang. Ere two soft tones rise through the rain, high, then low, fading just before lightning broke the sky. The Battle of the Washita River had long since been memorialized in textbooks, its tragedy folded neatly into history. But the Dawsons' disappearance, smaller, nameless, unresolved, remained personal to the land. No plaque marked the ridge, no prayer ended it. The mystery persisted, not as horror, but as quiet testimony to what the frontier never confessed. A final note survives from Dr. Helen Marrow, written decades earlier but discovered among her effects only after her death. The page was brittle, her handwriting faint. I do not believe in ghosts. I believe in repetition. Some things once spoken into earth continue to answer. Today the ridge is private land, fenced and empty, yet those who pass it at twilight sometimes pause, without knowing why, and lower their voices as they drive by. The wind there feels different, slower, heavier, as though carrying words too old to be understood. And if the air is still enough, if the world around you quiets for a breath, you might just hear it too. Two voices, distant and patient, singing softly into the dusk, never found, never gone.